Hello and welcome to the Working Across Generations webinar. My name is Natasha Munasinghe and I'm the CEO of a training and education organization called Frank. At Frank, we've worked with over 88,000 young people in terms of employability. So the purpose of today's webinar is to really inform and educate you about how to really get the best from the millennials and the generation that follows them, Generation Z, for the upcoming work placements. So this webinar has 3 parts. In part 1, we will cover off on the characteristics of millennials and Generation Z. In part 2, we will cover how best to engage these younger generations in the workplace. And finally, in part 3, we will cover onboarding tips and strategies for the students from pre-arrival stage to the first month stage. Now, something really important to remember is that the purpose of this host placement is to enable the students to learn and develop their employability and job readiness skills. Equally, it's important to remember that these are international students, and this is most likely their very first experience working in an Australian workplace and with Australians. It's an unfamiliar but exciting opportunity for them. They will also, however, be bringing with them a lot of assumptions and different cultural expectations, which you should be mindful of. Okay, let's kick off with part 1 of this webinar, the characteristics of millennials and Generation Z. Now, millennials are classified as anyone born from the early 1980s to the mid-1990s. Famous millennials, just for your reference, from the world of technology and celebrity include Mark Zuckerberg, Justin Bieber, and Jessica Alba. A Pew Research report stated the top 3 priorities for millennials, just FYI, are being a good parent, 52%, having a successful marriage, 30%, and helping others in need, 21%. This may be a little surprising as these are quite traditional priorities. Now, let's look at some of the common characteristics of millennials. Well, they have a preference for multitasking, which may mean they are quite productive, but it might also mean they have difficulty focusing on one task for an extended period of time. They're highly connected via social media and other communication technology, with 75% of them having a social media profile. They also tend to be quite tech savvy. They have grown up using computers and other technology, and they're heavy users of text messaging and online video. They also have a desire to be recognized for their efforts. This generation is achievement-oriented and is confident. A couple of more characteristics. They tend to have a desire for instant gratification and individual and regular feedback from supervisors. They are close to their parent and family-centric and look for flexibility in their schedules at work and a balance between work and life. Finally, they will question authority without fear and challenge ideas and motives. Okay, so those were the millennials. Now let's look at Generation Z, who are even younger. They're really the ones born from the mid-1990s to the mid-2010s. And even though they are similar to the millennials, there are some differences. And they're roughly between the ages of 5 and 21. They're also the first generation to be brought up entirely in the digital era. So they tend to plan their careers very early on, and they look for success and career progress very early on, things like pay rises and promotions. They like debate and will openly discuss previously taboo topics like politics and religion. They are hard to get, their attention is hard to get, and it's even harder to keep their attention. They want to change the world, that's a real thing for them, and they want to know that they're making an impact. Social media is also part of their identity. It's not just an innovation tool, and you're most likely to find them on Instagram and Snapchat than on Facebook. They, like the millennials, are heavy consumers of video and YouTube, and in terms of work, they look for honesty and integrity and mentoring from their managers. Their preferred working style is in a collaborative office environment. 84% of them expect their employer to provide some formal training. They also have a highly marketable digital mindset, which really can be an asset for your business. They do expect meaningful and challenging work and a clear skills path. They're looking for development in terms of their communication skills, problem-solving skills, and their management skills. And even though they live and breathe technology, they crave human experiences. For example, an in-person meeting during work. Now, what's the difference between Millennials and Generation Z? Because there are quite a few similarities. Now, keep these differences in mind when you're thinking about how best to engage your younger staff and the students during the work placements. So the Millennials have grown up with 2 screens, let's say a TV and a computer. Contrast that to the Generation Z, who've grown up with up to 5 screens at once. So let's say a computer, phone, TV, iPad, and a Kindle. They're much more savvy and it's innate to them. Whilst Millennials like to communicate with text, let's say text messaging, Generation Z like to communicate with images. That's why platforms like Snapchat and Instagram are quite popular with them. Millennials might like to curate and share information, while Generation Z are much more likely to create content, especially let's say during projects. Millennials are now focused, with their eye on the present and like to live in the moment. Generation Z are future focused, especially in terms of their careers. And while Millennials look for freedom and flexibility, so things like freelancing and entrepreneurship are popular in that category, Generation Z look for security and stability, and they're much more likely to stay in a job with one organization. Okay, now let's look specifically at the working styles of younger generations. Of the 4 generations that the Pew Research studied, Millennials were the only one that didn't cite work ethic as one of their principal claims to being distinctive. Generally, these younger generations prefer not to have longer working hours. They value personal time. And to employers, this may sometimes send the message that they don't care about work or they lack discipline. But for them, it's a question of priorities. They also expect a lot from their employer in terms of new challenges and the opportunity to achieve things. They see promotions and climbing the corporate ladder as a way to demonstrate their worth. They would seek to be included in important activities at work and may call attention to themselves by suggesting bold ideas and challenging the status quo. However, they do become concerned with what others think of them and do need affirmation or reaffirmation every now and then. There is a need for mentoring and one-on-one coaching. They see this as normal and expect it from their leaders, and they do like guidance and development when it comes to their careers. In the workplace, as the younger generations are motivated by achievement, they may create an environment of competition, which may be threatening to some of the older generations, and something just to be mindful of. Okay, now let's look at part 2 of this webinar, how to engage the younger generations at work. One way to do so is to find common ground. In order to successfully bridge the gap across generations, finding common ground enables you to effectively reach opposing generations. And to find common ground, there are 3 ways that I'll talk you through: adopting an effective communication style, creating an affinity group, and sharing knowledge. Now, let's see how adopting an effective communication style will help us find common ground. Being sensitive to the way you communicate will help you bridge the generation gap at work. The older generation may prefer face-to-face communication, whilst the younger generation may prefer electronic methods. And you want to give yourself some freedom and flexibility in your communication styles. So here is an easy way to adapt or adopt a communication style. Use the TAP method for communicating. T stands for to the point, so you make your communication brief and succinct. The older generation will appreciate the clarity, and the younger generation will appreciate the brevity. Then you think about A, adapting it. Change the method of communication for your audience. If you're going to engage an older worker, make the effort to either call them or better yet, see them in person. They will feel respected and valued. For the younger generation, use email or instant text messaging to reach them. They will feel independent and not micromanaged. Finally, being professional. When in doubt, always just keep it professional. Avoid jargon and text abbreviations in your communication. Use salutations and close your communication properly. You will show the older generation that you respect them and set the example for the younger generations on how to communicate professionally. Okay, So let's talk through about creating an affinity group. Now, affinity groups are groups of people sharing common interests. You can create such groups at work that give different generations a chance to work with each other with an activity which is not directly work-related. These groups provide a way for the generations to learn more about each other's interests and values. They tend to be non-hierarchical and are typically small and do not require any type of centralization. So here are some potential topics or groups to consider when it comes to an affinity group. You might think of a work newsletter group, a recycling task force, a community service group or a volunteering group, or even a work safety group. The final way to find common ground is to share knowledge. The lack of knowledge could breed fear between generations or lead to misinterpretations. Sharing knowledge helps you to break down the barriers and create an understanding and collaborative environment. There are many ways knowledge can be shared. Here are a few ways. You might think about setting up a blog where a topic is introduced and then letting the team submit comments. Blogs provide a safe and open structure to hold discussions. If you use a blog, be sure to set up the clear rules of what and how to share. And you really want to avoid sensitive topics for discussions. You might also think about forming focus groups to resolve an issue or generate new ideas. Focus groups including various generations is a great way to get different perspectives from your diverse work group. Have a facilitator manage the meeting and the group dynamics. You might also think about creating an online newsletter where employees get to share their thoughts in an interview-style format. This can be a creative way of sharing knowledge. You could also think about having an ideas box or using digital communication tools like Yammer or Slack, where employees can submit ideas for review by your team. You might also think about creating opportunities for reverse mentoring, where the student would mentor the employee or the older or more senior employee and provide guidance to them. For example, it might be around topics like social media and digital tools, where you can leverage the digital knowledge of the younger generations to help the organization, and in the process, you make them feel valued. Finally, you might consider enabling them to shadow you or their supervisor or manager. For example, they can accompany you when you attend meetings, meet with clients, and so forth. Ensure there are sufficient opportunities like these for the student to understand typical professional situations. Small as these tasks may seem, they're actually learning opportunities for students, and especially being international students. This is most likely the first time they're experiencing these situations in Australia. Now, when looking to engage the younger generations, here are some very simple communication tips. You might think about sharing your social impact as an organization and then show them how they're contributing to your organization's purpose. What is the impact they're making? You want to be authentic and inspiring in your communication style. You want to tell your story across multiple screens. And finally, you might consider cross-training the students so you can break down the organizational and functional barriers. Now, let's cover off on the final part to this webinar, part 3, which will look at onboarding tips and strategies. Now, younger generations tend to respond better to informal onboarding processes. Day-long orientation sessions, lecture-style orientation sessions, and endless reams of paperwork are at odds with their preference for multitasking, technology, and at times instant gratification. Find ways to onboard younger generations that draw on their preference for a fast pace, using a combination of technology and personal interactions. So some ideas for creating an informal onboarding program that will engage younger staff and students include using technology like videos and podcasts, or webinars, let's say in place of lectures or meetings. Maybe think about meeting with them one-on-one or in small groups, assigning a manager or a supervisor or team member to deliver the onboarding material one-on-one rather than in a large group setting is much more effective. Think about using a mix of activities and break the onboarding process into chunks and allow for some exploratory or unstructured time, if possible. Well, here is a bit of an onboarding checklist from pre-arrival to the first day to their first 90 or even 180 days. This will really help you when you're onboarding younger employees and students. Because these younger generations thrive on interaction and feedback, having a checklist of what they should be learning and experiencing at various stages in the onboarding process helps you as a manager provide the type of mentoring and feedback that they're looking for. Okay, so let's look at the pre-arrival stage. The onboarding process begins long before the student arrives for his or her first day at the office. Younger generations especially thrive on a great deal of contact from their manager or supervisor in the days leading up to the first days of work. They really appreciate the clear guidelines and the expectations. Providing a pre-arrival checklist not only helps the manager or supervisor effectively prepare for his or her first day, but also provides the student with the structure they need and kind of helps them feel a little less anxious about starting the host placement. So here are some things you could use or include in the pre-arrival stage. If possible, contact the student leading up to the first day. And as they may prefer email or phone, even something simple like sending an email or text message before they start the placement, saying you're looking forward to meeting them can make a big difference. Determine what the student needs to know to start off successfully, including answers to any questions that may come up during the email or phone contact. Prepare a packet with relevant organizational charts, company policies, and other materials to supplement any orientation the student undergoes. 4. Provide a clear outline of the student's job responsibilities, including a job description. Clearly outline the student's learning path during the host placement, and provide clear expectations for the first week, month, quarter at work. These are things you want to be thinking of pre-arrival. You might also want to set up the necessary technology, the email, the computer workstation, and so on. You might want to think about stocking up the workstation with supplies. And finally, you might want to send an email to the student's team members introducing him or her to them. So I also wanted to share with you 5 tips when it comes to developing a job description. Providing the student with a project description and make sure it includes the following: the tasks the students will complete, the time frame for completion, the technology the student will be required to use, stakeholders or team members the students will need to interact with, and an idea of what success looks like, so the student's performance can be evaluated at a later date. Now let's look at the checklist for arrival and first day actions. Once the items from the pre-arrival checklist are in place, the first day should go fairly smoothly. Having a checklist of items that need to occur or be in place on the first day a student arrives at the organization is key to alleviating their anxiety. And you also make sure the important stuff is covered off on. Some items to include on the checklist are: assigning someone to greet the student or do so yourself, give the student a tour of the work areas, their cube or their office, the common areas, the restroom, the supply areas, and escort them to the orientation meeting. Set up lunch with them or with their team members. And if lunch is provided as part of orientation, set this up for the first week. Introduce the student to those he or she will be working closely with. A couple of other items on arrival and first day. Inform them of the professional behaviors that are expected of them and which the ones they should do and the ones they shouldn't do. Remember, this is the first and most likely their first time in an Australian workplace, and really maybe in a first time in a workplace itself. And so you should really cover off on things like how they should communicate with their manager or supervisor. Example, not peppering their manager with every question that comes to mind and constantly interrupting them. And they need the level of coaching and guidance at this stage. You should also think about reviewing the procedures for telephone and computer usage, including personal usage rules around things like social media whilst at work. You might think about assigning them a buddy. This is someone closer to their age, who isn't their line manager, and who can relate to their experiences a little. This buddy can provide advice to them even on the small things like how to print something, how to access the internet, and so on. These are things that they might feel shy or embarrassed about asking someone very senior to them. Finally, you might like to take time to explain the work of the unit or the department, including reviewing the organizational chart. This can also, of course, be done in the first week. So managing organizational expectations is also important prior to hiring an international student. Ensure that the student's prospective manager and supervisor has planned to put aside time to meet and induct the student into the organization and provide the training and support they need. The student's team and other organizational stakeholders should also be informed of the placement, so they are aware if the student needs any additional support or guidance. So now let's look at the first week actions. As onboarding should always be continuous. Remember that younger generations are used to frequent contact with and feedback from their mentors, and they also thrive when the guidelines are clear. So some items to include on the first week. Clearly outline the training requirements, if any, and the job expectations. Establish milestones the students should meet and let them know it's okay to ask you if they have any questions. Being international students, they're probably going to be shy. Work with the student to set any individual goals and develop a learning path for them. Ensure, or if possible, set a one month goal or even maybe a fortnight goal with the student. Ensure that the student has completed all the necessary paperwork as well as all the necessary training, and set aside time for an informal catch-up. Now, finally, let's look at some things you can do at the first month point. Because the younger generations thrive on structure, a first month checklist may be useful for you. Some studies have shown that millennials, for example, decide within the first 6 weeks whether they will stay at a new job. Some items to consider for the first month: provide regular one-on-one feedback on the student's performance, solicit any informal feedback from the student's teammates or supervisors or supervisees, if any, and set aside time to check in informally with the student to answer any questions that they probably do have at this point. For organizations that have engaged international students like yours in placements, there may be some additional placements additional requirements post-placement. These may include reporting to the education provider on the student's performance, or the internship provider if you were using one, reporting to the management or HR on the performance of the students and the overall success of the placement, providing the student with a reference for future employment or recommendation on LinkedIn. That will be very valuable for them. Or finally, if your organization is satisfied with the student's performance, maybe considering or endeavoring to keep in touch with the student and keeping them in mind for any ongoing opportunities. Many students value the chance to really create a professional network. So that brings us to the end of this webinar. Now, I realize depending on the resources of your organization, you may not be able to implement all these actions, but hopefully you have learned a few tips and strategies that you might like to implement. As a recap to this webinar, things we've covered off on: in part 1, the characteristics of Millennials and Generation Z. In part 2, how best to engage the younger generations in the workplace. And finally, in part 3, we looked at onboarding tips and strategies for students, from pre-arrival to the first month stages. A little note on this webinar to conclude: the Upskill Through Work Integrated Learning project is co-funded through Study New South Wales Partner Projects Program and the University of Newcastle. Study New South Wales is a dedicated unit within the Department of Industry focused on making the experiences of international students better, safer, and more enjoyable when they live and study in New South Wales. Study New South Wales supports partner projects that align with its objectives and are jointly funded and delivered with organizations in the international education sector. For more information on Study New South Wales, there's the website on screen. Okay, thank you for listening to this webinar. You can connect with me and the Frank team on our Facebook and LinkedIn channels.